Hi, everybody. My name is Jake Friedman. I serve as the senior coordinator at the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing at Arizona State University. It is 1:08 p.m. Phoenix Mountain Standard Time, the most confusing Mountain Standard Time of any Mountain Standard Time, although I'm willing to be open to changing my mind about that. And you are at All About the Roundhouse with Joe Buenker as part of the NEA Big Read Phoenix. I'm getting a little feedback from somebody, so this is a great opportunity to say that if you have your microphone on at this point and you are not speaking, it will be best to have that off just to minimize any potential disruptions. We have 36 people here, which is lovely, and we do have the ability to see each other too. But sometimes seeing each other can create problems for the bandwidth. So during the presentation, it might also be a good idea to have your video turned off. We will have sorry, somehow I accidentally muted myself somehow. You will, this is a great illustration of technical things for Zoom. We will have an opportunity to speak and engage with each other at points during the presentation and at an open Q&A at the end. We have chosen a meeting room today because we had a manageable audience, and I think that the meeting room is slightly more connected than the webinar, but it does just require us to be a little bit more aware of our microphones, our video, and to work together to have a really great experience here. So thank you for your help in creating that experience. Please send me a private message, an email, or text me at the number listed in the chat if you do have any issues on the technical side, and I will work to get those figured out. In terms of some quick technical things, I do just want to provide a link in the chat to Joe's presentation today that will be sent out probably afterwards as well via an email. But if it's easier for you to view this in a separate screen rather than the screen share just for accessibility, please feel free to utilize that. In terms of some other technical moments before, again, actually starting this event, Joe's going to have a presentation. It's maybe 30-ish minutes, 40-ish minutes, however long it takes Joe to present the material that he's interested in presenting today. We're going to pause for questions during and throughout that presentation. We'll have some times in between transitions. I'll be moderating that Q&A, and I'll be kind of looking to the chat for that as well. So while you're welcome to post comments and thoughts in the chat, I think that's actually a really lovely feature of Zoom and a great way to connect and to kind of get a little bit more out of this experience. We will be using that for questions there too. So if you have a question, please just post that there. If I don't see that, please just unmute and create an awkward situation, and we will work through it to then create space for you to speak, right? We'll also have an open Q&A at the end, so that will be a little bit easier for us to manage too. Again, I'll be moderating that Q&A and selecting from the chat and then offering an opportunity to speak if you'd like to speak more to that. So I think that covers all of our technical questions. Again, this is sort of a larger room for a meeting. So if you do have any questions, please just send me a private message and I will respond to it there. I think with that, what I would like to do then is just say a few brief words on behalf of the center about the grant, give a pretty informal and sort of heartwarming introduction for Joe, and then just turn it over to him. I think I can do that in like 2 or 3 minutes. So I would like to start with a land acknowledgement from the center, right? And so this is a practice that we have started doing. We will be having a panel on this later as well to kind of talk a little bit more about the politics and some of our values regarding that. But we do think it's really important, particularly within the context of the grant, that we are framing the programming that we're doing in the history of the communities that have lived here. So I just want to kind of read that, make a few comments, and then turn it over to Joe. We are virtual today, right? But the Piper Writers House and Arizona State University's 4 campuses are situated on the unceded ancestral lands of the Acamel Oldham, the Pima, the Peepash, the Maricopa, and many other indigenous peoples. We recognize the original stewards of this land and honor those living here today, including the Gila River Indian community, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, the Pascua Yaqui tribe, and the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation. Indigenous lives, knowledge, and stories have been rooted here long before the university came to be. They remain central to the past, present, and future of this land, into the Piper Center's current mission and literary communities. As an institution that serves writers and readers both within and beyond Arizona, we commit to challenging narratives that obscure this history and to using our resources to support and celebrate the voices of Native American and Indigenous writers. We can think of no better place to start that effort than this grant, the NEA Big Read Phoenix. We are embarking upon a month of programming to celebrate Indigenous literary arts and culture across the Valley, and to celebrate the work of folks who are here and doing that, right? There's not a lot that I want to say further about that, because I will start rambling and perhaps expressing some values and political opinions and beliefs that are perhaps better kept for other conversation over the course of the month. So I do just want to say specifically before kind of introducing Joe that we're really, really grateful to you for participating in this programming with us and taking the time to pay attention to some of the people and the work and the culture that is here, right? Arizona really is one of the most Indigenous places in the nation. And the nation has spent a very, very long time trying to remove that culture and to remove those communities. This is a very, very small effort to try and create some more space for that, right? To celebrate those voices and to really do that around this book, The Roundhouse. So we have a lot of different programming over the month, things that are looking at the Roundhouse directly as a literary text, as a way to highlight writers or highlight community organizations that are here to sort of raise some concerns, right, that we might have to address those. But I think that our focus really primarily is on celebration, right, is our sort of key word. There are just so many incredible books and readings and conversations that are taking place that are led by Indigenous community members, and those are the voices that personally I think are the only some of the only perspectives and voices that are going to allow us to have a future where we all exist if it's not too late. So that is my sort of small personal aside. It is my really great pleasure to sort of introduce informally Joe Buenker from Arizona State University Library. Joe Buenker is probably the most knowledgeable person about Louise Erdrich within Arizona State University. And early on in this grant, in some of our conversations with ASU Library, Librarian Center, Joe was really gracious and generous enough to share some of the knowledge that he's accumulated around the Roundhouse to kind of just help us better understand this as a text, right? So this is a little bit more of a literary, critical, what we might even call sort of an academic presentation in some ways. You know, Joe is going to present information about the author, about, you know, other literary histories that kind of inform there. We're going to do our best to not give any spoilers or plot points away. But, you know, with all the work that we're doing, connecting with communities and sort of doing family history and community archiving, we also felt that it was really important to provide to treat Louise's text as a text proper, right? And so we're really, really grateful to have this space, especially as we continue to do book clubs or have other conversations and really be thinking about what this book can teach us, right? How we can cherish the gift that Louise Erdrich has given to us. So maybe you will join me in sort of, you know, raising your hands in a silly way if your video is on. Perhaps you can post some things in the chat. I really like a left caret sign and a 3 that kind of looks like a heart. Perhaps there are other graphic expressions of love that you can post in there as we maybe hold also a moment of silence, gratitude, and space for Joe Buenker. So, yay. Don't unmute because we're trying to keep things quiet, but Joe, thank you so much. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Jake. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Couple of things real quickly before we get started. I do want to acknowledge that I was supposed to be video sharing. Unfortunately, with technology, Jake and I were checking in right before 10 minutes before the presentation, and my laptop started to make a horrible screeching noise. and I had to power it off, and it has restarted, but I'm a little bit hesitant about using that one, even though it has a camera. I'm fortunate that I'm at work and I have access to a full computer. So I'm using my full computer, which is good for me, but unfortunately you won't be able to see me. And so I do apologize for that. With that being said, my name is Joe Buenker. I'm a humanities librarian with associate librarian rank at Arizona State University. And the very first thing I really want to say today is that I am so grateful to be a part of the NEA Big Read Phoenix 2021 programming for the Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. I look forward to attending many of the related events that are being coordinated for this big read. And I definitely want to do a turnaround and thank Jake Friedman on behalf of the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing at Arizona State University. I am very giddy to be here and talking. Anyone who knows me, especially my family members, know I have been a Louise Erdrich fan, collector, reader for close to 3 decades. And so I'm kind of geeking out and very appreciative to be here. I want to thank each of you individually for choosing to attend today's session. Again, I encourage you, as Jake did, to take a look at the full events and partners at the Piper page on the NEA Big Read. As Jake mentioned, I'm going to do kind of an informal academic-ish presentation. If you do have questions, go ahead and send them in chat, or if you're speaking up, that's okay. Jake's going to kind of monitor questions for me so that I can focus on my PowerPoint presentation. And with that being said, I'll just pause here and check in with Jake to see if there's anything that we need to do before I move on.
I think just be grateful and thank you. So yeah, proceed.
Okay, great. Again, I'm a librarian with Arizona State University, the ASU Library. I recently celebrated my 20th anniversary with the university, and for more than a decade, my primary work responsibilities have been in support of the students and faculty of the Department of English at the Tempe campus. I'm a member of the ASU Library's Humanity Division within our overall Engagement and Learning Services unit. And I just want to take a moment in terms of the NEA Big Read and the ASU Library. I want to acknowledge that I've worked with Alex Soto, Emily Patney, Joyce Martin, and Rachel Leckett-Moore, a small group of ASU librarians who have discussed what our supporting library guide on the Big Read would include and what books to include in the Big Read curated collection that we are putting together at the ASU Library Hayden Library. So just real briefly, I want to do a new screen share here for you. And I will go ahead and just show you here briefly the page that we have. You may have seen this when you were registering, but if not, I just kind of want to note that we do have a ASU library guide, and let me get there. Sorry about this. There we go. So are you all seeing now the Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich from the ASU Library webpage?
We are.
Okay, great. So what I just wanted to point out about this is where I've been kind of battling myself in terms of how much attention I've been spending on getting my presentation ready and how much I've been working on helping our efforts to put together this guide. And we will continue to add to this guide throughout the programming for the entire Big Read grant. What I wanted to do just to show a little bit to start off with is a little bit about Erdrich's productivity, if you will, just how much she's authored at the book level, and to point out the availability of some of the resources on our library guide. So just real quickly, I just want to do that here. You can see, for example, there's a couple of different tabs. There's one labeled Books by Erdrich. There's one Books about Erdrich. And then we have some ASU resources. These are on things that are kind of thematic elements that are either from the book or in response to the book. And we're trying to make sure that we're making it real clear as to what things are freely available, or what librarians may call open access, and what things are paywall protected or subscription resources. And we're also working on putting together a list of take action websites. These are American Indian organizations, government, legislative, activist organizations, encouraging people to raise greater awareness about some of the issues that have been brought to light by Erdrich in this book. And so what I just want to do briefly is just show you, for example, the Erdrich books by year and title. And so
Can I pause you for just a
sure.
second, Joe, and ask you to, if it's possible to zoom in a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, totally. That's
Okay.
perfect. Yeah. And if anybody is having any challenges too, you can adjust the view options for even more control. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you, Jake. Good suggestion. So I just wanted to show you again a little bit briefly, and I'll touch on this here in a few minutes. Erdrich's first two books came out in 1984. So we're talking just over 35 years, 36 years. And the first book, their first year that she was published, 1984, she came out with a book of poems and then a novel. And then 2 years later, another novel, 2 years later, another novel, another book of poetry, a small limited press book of travel around a particular highway, Route 2. The one book that she's co-authored with someone officially, The Crown of Columbus. And so you can scroll through this and see all these different book titles and all of that sort of thing. The one thing I want to note, if you're not an ASU person, and I see we have people from out of state, I know some of you from out of state, others I don't, I have a link here to this this little icon that says WorldCat. What this will do is if you click on this, for example, it will launch a pop-up window, and it will then connect you to the WorldCat database, and it will see what your computer address is, and it'll tell you which libraries near you geographically are known to own this particular book, and you can connect to their catalog and things like that. So the guide is intended to really promote the availability of books by Erdrich to our local community, but it's also available for people that want to just get familiar with her books overall. Like sometimes people, because she's written so much, they're like, well, what book should I start with? And so there's a couple things you can do. If I switch back here for a second, just to show you, if I switch back to hers, she's done a lot of different genres, which I'll talk about here in a few minutes. But you can see, for example, she has two books that are kind of memoirs, autobiography. The Blue Jays Dance in particular is a kind of a amalgamation of her notes when she's been pregnant.
Hey, the big man's back. www.
Thank you, Jake. So
Signs on the highway, billboards.
So she has a couple of books that are kind of in the autobiography realm, and she has a couple of children's books, a couple of nonfiction books of essays, and then she's got what she's most well known for, a lot of novels. I believe she's now on her 17th or 18th novel. And if you just scroll through here, for example, I actually discovered less than a month ago, she has a new novel coming out later in October. This book is called The Sentence, and that's all I really know about it at this point. I haven't been able to discover much more. She's more or less stepped away from having her poetry published. She still writes it, but she doesn't really publish it at this point. The last book of poetry came out in 2003. And there's a few other things besides the novels and the poetry. She's also increasingly well known for her young adult novels. She has a series that's often called the Birch Bark House series, and it's titles, she has 5 of them published so far: The Birch Bark House, The Game of Silence, The Porcupine Year, Chickadee, and Macoons. And she basically started this series because she was a fan, as were many people, of Laura Ingalls Wilder. But when she started reading the books as a grown adult woman to her kids, she started realizing just how prevalent the racism and the condescension and the complete lack of acknowledgement of the indigenous presence in that area in Wilder's writing was. And she did not feel super comfortable reading these to her younger children after a while. And so she decided she wanted to give an alternative type of young adult novel, and that she wanted her children to be able to learn those sorts of things through reading so that they could pass them on to their children, and presenting an indigenous position. So she's got quite a scope of writing. And I just wanted to take a couple minutes here at the start just to point out that that is one of the things that you can discover by going to the library guide. You can get a real good sense of the history of her book level publications. So with that, I'll just pause and check in with Jake.
If anyone has any questions, great time to ask or chat. If you do yell about billboards, we will have to remove you, unfortunately. But yeah, no, I mean, I guess, Joe, the only question I might have here, and then maybe, you'll speak to this shortly, but
Sure.
Louise is sort of most well known for her novels, correct? Like as an author in her opus,
Right.
that's really where she came in, even though she started from poetry and has dabbled in some of these other genres or forms.
Yeah, very good point. Like a lot of beginning writers, and I'll touch on this, Erdrich did complete a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth University, and then she went on to complete a master's degree in creative writing from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. She's from the Dakota areas and lives in Minnesota, but until she went away to college undergrad, she had been entirely in North Dakota and Minnesota as far as where her permanent address where her parents lived. So she started out after her creative writing program. She did Poets in the Schools and things like that in North Dakota. And like a lot of beginning writers, she was first published in literary magazines and also like newspapers and things like that, both poems and short stories. One of her first short stories, The World's Greatest Fisherman, which actually is the opening chapter of her first novel, The Love Medicine, she won the initial Nelson Algren Prize from the Chicago Tribune for that story. And that success and her partnership with her then husband, Michael Doris, they built the framework for her novel Love Medicine around all these different short stories that she had. And so she came out with Love Medicine, and Love Medicine was a smashing success. It won several major awards for both first book and book of the year by major organizations and associations. And so as she's been more successful, and she's one of the very few writers, professional writers, creative writing fiction, that has never had to work another full-time job since her first book was published. She has never had to, and it's not a negative had to, but she's never taught, for example, at universities. A lot of creative writing faculty members are published writers, poets, short stories, novelists, but she's been very successful enough where she hasn't had to have a full-time thing to support her writing. And so she's obviously been able to concentrate on her writing. She has some other interests, which I'll talk about, including her own bookstore, which she opened in the Minneapolis area in mid-2000. But again, I just wanted to point out some of these things that she's primarily viewed as a novelist, and her major life achievement awards are for her novels. There's a lot of recognition for her young adult novels. Her poetry has been anthologized quite well, but because she basically hasn't published any in the last 18, close to 20 years, they would just have to be recycling her already anthologized poems. And so there's, again, the emphasis for her has been novels and young adult novels. And she talks about in a couple of interviews that she's essentially writing one big story. And as she's getting older, she was born in 1954, she's realizing that the clock is ticking now more than it was in 1984 when she first really started out on a big stage. So she's increasingly trying to make sure that she's concentrating on the books that will answer questions or tie up loose ends from some of her previous existing novels. But she's done a lot in different areas. But long story short, Jake, I hope that answers your question, that she's gone a lot of different genres, but today she's definitely noted for being a novelist.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And just two quick things, I guess, if that's okay, before we move on to the next. You mentioned The World's Greatest Fisherman, which was a short story that opened Love Medicine.
Yes.
Cool. And then Mary had a question about changes to later editions of the book.
Oh, sure.
Have there been changes to later editions? Has she kind of updated it as she's sort of moved towards completing this world in some ways?
Yes, that's a really great question, Mary. Thank you. Erdrich is one of those people that it's a little uncommon for established prize-winning authors, especially Western authors, especially my knowledge is especially on American writers, where not only did Love Medicine win major awards and it was heavily anthologized, individual chapters, which started out as short stories for magazines. She doesn't view it as a finished product, though. She views all of her books as in progress stories. And similar to this oral tradition in indigenous cultures, stories aren't fixed. Stories evolve and change, or they become stagnant and don't survive. And so Erdrich has done some things that a lot of people would be very puzzled or would view as kind of taboo. She's actually rewritten some of her books. For example, The Antelope Wife, which I have up on the screen here, she first released this in 1998. And she really didn't like it after writing other things and thinking about some characters. While she was writing The Roundhouse, which we're again talking about today, which came out in 2012, 2012 also saw her release The Antelope Wife, a second edition. It's majorly rewritten. She actually wanted to call it The Antelope Woman to make that really clear, to give it a different title, but the publisher didn't really want to put it under a different name. So The Antelope Wife has had two different editions 14 years apart. The one that most people are familiar with is her first novel, which I mentioned before, Love Medicine. It came out in 1984, and it was about 275 pages long. In 1993, she released it in a new and expanded version. She did some minor edits to some of the existing chapters, and then she actually added 4 more chapters, and she reordered a couple of the chapters. And so the book went from 275 pages to 367. And so many people know that, oh, she revised Love Medicine. There's 2 editions, right? Well, actually, there's 3 editions. She revised it again, and it was published in 2013. The 2013 changes aren't as substantial as the changes between the first 2 editions, but there's 3 editions. What's really unfortunate is that most people don't know that, and there's nothing obviously in the first or second edition that tells you there's a 3rd edition. So many people, if they are aware that Love Medicine has more than 1 edition, they're aware there's 2, but most people have no idea, including most critics. I recall reading 2 critics, one who did a whole book on Erdrich actually talks about the 3 different editions of Love Medicine, but most critics assume that, oh, wow, you know, she made a radical departure. She revised it and published it again. And of course, that's all you would ever do, right? You made 1 change and now you're done. She's actually made another change, but again, most people aren't aware of it because it's the same title. It doesn't officially say 3rd edition on it. I put those in brackets on the website so that you can see the official title of the first version from 1984, Love Medicine, a novel. The second, Love Medicine, new and expanded version. And then the 3rd novel, she goes back to Love Medicine, or her publisher goes back to Love Medicine, a novel. It's not really in your face that it's a reworked version of that novel.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. It's so clear that you are like literally the foremost scholar, not only at ASU, but all around. So thank you so much for answering that question so in depth.
Thank you very much. I want to just quickly jump back a little bit. I have a lot of things I want to talk, and I'm hopefully not going to jump around too much, but I just wanted to mention for, I know there's several of people here that have some ties to ASU. I just wanted to real briefly mention that I was an undergraduate student at ASU's West Campus for a year, and I really got on my path of American Indian literature from a course that I took at Arizona State University. I took a course on American Indian Literature, is a 300 level course where we read poetry, short story anthologies, and several novels. The short story and poetry anthologies included work by established writers like Joy Harjo, who's the US Poet Laureate now, Simon J. Ortiz, Wendy Rose. We also read novels by who's usually credited as the father, the grandfather, if you will, these days, N. Scott Momaday, Leslie Marmon Silko, James Welch, Paula Gunn Allen, excuse me, and Louise Erdrich. I just wanted to mention, like, for me, I'm a librarian at the university, and I get to buy books, including a lot of American Indian, First Nation Canadian novels, literature. This is kind of a full circle for me in terms of being able to start out learning about this in college, and now in my role as a librarian to help others learn about it by purchasing materials for the collection and promoting the availability of those materials through our library guide. I just want to check in with you, Jake. I think I have probably we're at like 1:38. I think I'm going to skip forward and jump back a little bit back to the PowerPoint here for a second, so I make sure I cover there. Are there any questions, Jake, that we have, or we're doing okay?
No, I think we're doing great. Yeah. So if anybody continues to have them, feel free to post, and then we'll open up at the end.
Okay. So what I wanted to do is just mention that what I've been doing on American Indian literature in general, I started doing research on Erdrich when I was in my library school program. And what I ended up doing was kind of a selective annotated bibliography of where Erdrich had published her poems, short stories, her novels, finding reviews of those, book reviews in newspapers, journals, magazines, things like that, critical articles on her, finding a couple websites, things like that. And what I've been really doing over time is there are a couple of reference books out there that are kind of like supposedly the definitive guides to American Indian literature. And they typically will recognize 15, 20, 25 writers, which is great. And these are tremendous writers who have a lot of accomplishment. But there literally are hundreds, close to, if I had to guess from what I've documented so far, there are close to 1,000 American Indian writers in poetry, short stories, novels, children's and young adult, close to 1,000 American Indian writers who have had one or more books published. And so that's what I've been doing, is trying to document that. And I've been doing a lot of that by looking at anthologies of American Indian literature. And because borders aren't as impressive or as permanent as we think they are, and of course, historically, the borders that we recognize weren't borders in terms of Canada, Mexico, and the US. I've also looked a lot at First Nations Canadian writing. And what I've done with those is I've created index of these writers, and then I've got the names and I looked them up in a database called WorldCat, and there's a free version of it called worldcat.org. And I try to find a list of the books that these people have authored, edited, translated, things like that. And I'm just kind of creating a major list. I don't intend to make any money off of this. I intend to make this into like a free database, time permitting and everything, but I'm really, really impressed with the quality of the writing of so many of these writers. And my ultimate goal is to bring more attention to these writers, not just to the people that create and implement the curriculum, but to the people who on their own time want to explore and read more. Because there are many, many really great writers out there. But if you had to ask people, they typically have difficult time mentioning more than maybe 3 or 4, or if they're really informed, they might know a couple of dozen writers that are American Indian or First Nation Canadian. I can't recall all of these, obviously, myself. That's why I have it kind of in a little database at this point. But my goal is to bring more attention to this and make it into kind of a public website where people can learn about this and connect to some of the titles for the books, just to get a sense of what's out there. Okay, so one thing I did want to do, this was like for everyone or for many people, this was a tough year for me personally, and I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that this is really something I want to dedicate my presentation to my dad, who unfortunately passed away in early April. And so I just wanted to acknowledge him here today. Talking a little bit about some more with American Indian authors, there are a few that have ties to Arizona State University, namely Simon Ortiz, Laura Tohi, who is an NEA Big Read partner, and Natalie Diaz. And just a little bit here, Simon Ortiz, who is from the Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, he's an emeritus professor of English. And the Labriola Center at ASU Library since 2008 has invited a prominent, eminent American Indian writer, theorist, scholar to be their guest speaker for the Simon Ortiz Red Ink Indigenous Speaker Series. I should mention at this point, the PowerPoint, which we will be sharing, has hyperlinks at the end in the references section. So you can get a list of the names of people who've presented. And they actually have their videos of their recordings, full text online, streaming online, whatever you want to say. You can watch some of the previous speakers for free going back to 2008. Simon Ortiz also gifted his papers to the Labriola Center, and overview of the papers is available on Arizona Archives Online. And I imagine, again, post-COVID times, that there will be scholars and students of American Indian literature that are coming to the Labriola Center to actually dig into his papers. Laura Tohi, I've actually taught a couple library research instruction classes for her when she was an active faculty member with the university. She too is now emeritus and a partner with the Big Read. She's Danae Navajo. She's authored a book of poetry, No Parole Today. She's co-editor with one of Erdrich's sisters, Hyde, of an anthology called Sister Nations. She's done a book of essays with photography of Canyon de Chelly, which is spiritually significant. And she's also done a lot of work on Navajo code talkers. And she published a book, authored a book, which was published in 2012 about Navajo code talkers, the history. And finally, an active ASU American Indian poet, Natalie Diaz, who is really setting the literary world on fire the last few years. She has a book of poems, her second one that came out last year, called Post-Colonial Love Poem. And I just want to kind of little segue here is many of you have probably seen that Deb Haaland, who is a member of Congress from the state of New Mexico, she's Laguna Pueblo and Jemez Pueblo. She's actually, and I know this from my work on my anthologies, Deb Haaland, before she got involved in government, she's actually contributed 2 short stories to 2 American Indian literature anthologies. One is Reinventing the Enemy's Language from 1997, and the other is Sister Nations from 2002. So this is just kind of a little trivia for you. And I will note, I think that this poster is really, really cool. There's a second one, which I'm going to show you, of Joy Harjo. The hyperlinks to where you can download the posters for free online through the Library of Congress are listed at the end of this presentation. There's an artist called Bunky Echohawk, and his father is a well-known lawyer, and he comes from a pretty esteemed family. Bunky Echohawk went to the Institute of American Indian Arts down in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he's a really great stylist, designer, and he's done these posters of Deb Haaland and another one, which I'll show you here in a few minutes, of Joy Harjo. Just to kind of mention a few things here quickly, because Jake and I agreed we really didn't want to talk a lot about the plot given how early we are into the Big Read program. We didn't really want to do a whole lot of things on the plot of the Roundhouse in terms of it's a difficult book not to get into the spoilers, given the opening, shocking, dramatic things that happen in the first few pages. But for example, if you wanted to know, well, who are some other writers that I would maybe want to learn about, or that are considered to be really accomplished American Indian writers, there's a Lifetime Achievement Award that's been voted on by the Native Writers Circles of the Americas. And I just put together an alphabetical by last name list here, and you can see some of the names in there. Erdrich Louise has won that. She was given that award in 2000. And I believe the last year it was awarded was in 2018. I didn't find anything about 2019 or 2020 recipients. I believe the Native Writers Circles of the Americas is limited to a Facebook page, and they do have an open vote going right now. But that's just one way of kind of getting a list of some names. Here's the poster I mentioned about Joy Harjo, who is currently the Poet Laureate of the United States. One thing I wanted to show you here, besides the the poster, is her project, her signature project for the Library of Congress in her role as Poet Laureate is called Living Nations, Living Words, A Map of First Peoples Poetry by Joy Harjo. And so I've copied this here, and you'll see there's some reoccurring names, for example, on the slide I'm showing you. Sherwin Bitsui, who also went to the Institute of American Indian Arts. Natalie Diaz from ASU, she used to work at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Here's our friend Louise Erdrich, Laylee Long Soldier, who is a partner with the NEA Big Reads, Joy Harjo herself. And what's great about this collection from the Library of Congress, and again, the hyperlink to this site is included at the references at the end of this presentation. You can go online. Harjo has worked with a team from the Library of Congress, and they've actually done audio recordings of 47 indigenous poets, 41 of whom are American Indian. There are about 3 or 4 Hawaiian natives and a couple of natives from Guam, I believe, that are also included in the collection. And this is kind of their interactive map. And you can kind of go and see, and it kind of digs down where you can get a lot of information about who these people are. So I'm going to pause at that point and now just check in with Jake before I kind of get into a little background about Erdrich.
Yeah, I think, so again, we just posted a link to the PDF as kind of a stopgap solution until we can follow up after the presentation about the PowerPoint itself. But I think that, Joe, you're all set. Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, and again, we'll put a lot of this up on the library guide. Just a couple of quick things here too. Erdrich's parents met in the North Dakota area. They were both teachers at a Bureau of Indian school, and they got married in 1953. And I found this picture of them after they'd been married outside the church steps. And then here's a much more recent picture of her parents. On the left is her dad, Ralph, and on the right is her mom, Rita. And I learned, unfortunately, the very last day of December 2020, her father passed away. And so what's great about it, though, is her parents were married, if I remember correctly, doing the math, 53, they were married for 67 years. And Erdrich is one of 7 children. Ralph, her father, was the son of German immigrants. And Rita Joanne Gourneau, she was, as I said before, she was an employee of the Wahpeton Indian School, just like her father. The school has been now put under tribal control. It's called the Circle of Nations, Wahpeton Indian School. Louise and her siblings did not, even though they are enrolled in the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe, they did not grow up on the reservation. They grew up mostly in the Bureau of Indian Schools housing because both of her parents taught there. Louise did attend St. John's School, a Catholic school, and then she went to public schools. And if you've read some of her writing, especially some of her early poetry and her novels, she calls herself a lapsed Catholic. There's a lot of Catholic elements in her writing, and she says that Catholicism still has a powerful hold on her, and so there's a lot of things about religion, both Catholic, because she is biracial, she's German American, and she's Chippewa or Ojibwe, and so there's a lot of information out there about religious symbolism and things like that. But again, just unfortunately learned while I was actually doing some research for this presentation about a month or so ago, I learned that her father had passed away. There's a picture of the school grounds a little bit earlier than when Erdrich's parents were there. The school actually opened in 1904. Just real quickly, you know, how did Erdrich actually become a writer? There's a fairly famous quote from a book called Survival This Way, Interviews with American Indian Poets by Joseph Brucock, who's an Abenaki writer. And he said, when did you first begin to write poetry or to write anything? And Erdrich replied, well, my dad used to pay me ever so often. He'd pay me a nickel for a story. So I started a long time ago. both my mom and dad were encouraging, incredibly encouraging. I had the kind of childhood where I didn't feel art was something strange. I felt that it was good for you to do it. And just a quick side note here, Joseph Brucock, if you've not read him or are aware of him, Erdrich is prolific at the book level, but Joseph Brucock has authored poetry collections, children's books, young adult novels to the tune of over 115 books. He is highly, highly prolific and one of my favorite writers. He is a really talented writer. He's a very talented speaker. Two of his sons are actually in now doing more of traditional storytelling, and one of his son is involved in language revitalization efforts, and the other one is kind of in charge of a literary cultural community that is trying to bring more attention to New England area American Indian writers. Just kind of chugging along here, trying to monitor the time a little bit. Some of the things, some big things about Erdrich and her major wins. And you'll see I've kind of bolded and put in red font the Roundhouse. She's won several awards at the book level, including the Teen Readers and Adult Books from the Adult Library Service, Young Adult Library Services Association. She won the American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation for Love Medicine, and then for the Roundhouse. The Birch Bark House, one of her young adult series, the first one in that series, has won an award. In terms of Lifetime Achievement Awards, she has been awarded the Native Writers Circle of the Americas, as I mentioned. She's an honorary fellow of the Modern Languages Association. Famously, a little bit, it's been about 13, 14 years ago, the University of North Dakota wanted to give her an honorary doctorate, and she declined because she did not agree with their continued use of a logo and the Fighting Sioux nickname for the college. She had been aware that there were people, including faculty and students, that had asked the school to retire the mascot, if you will, and to retire the nickname and things like that. There was a big donor who funded the renovation of the hockey arena at the University of North Dakota. And so the university did not give her the doctorate. She declined it. She was, however, given the honorary Doctor of Letters in 2009 by her alma mater, Dartmouth College, and she was actually the commencement speaker that same year. In 2014, she was given a Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Holbrook Distinguished Achievement Award, 2014, also the Penn Saul Bellow Award for Achievement in American Fiction, and the Library of Congress Prize in American Fiction in 2015. Here's a little bit more about some of her book wins. Sorry, I think I may have kind of put these a little bit out of order. She's a 5-time winner, the most awarded winner in Minnesota Book Awards history. And the last one she won was for the Roundhouse. The Roundhouse has won a couple of other ones you can see there. And so you can just see she's won several different awards for different books, including she won the World Fantasy Award for the first version of The Antelope Wife in 1919. I do have on here, we probably won't have a lot of time to play this, but I put a little note on here. I did find Erdrich's acceptance speech for the 2012 National Book Award for Fiction, which she won for the Roundhouse. And there's little notes on here that you can go and play this clip. I used their little clipping feature where I cut it out of the nearly 2-hour long program. And I just had to keep the 3 minutes or so where Erdrich is on stage talking. But she talks about some of the things in the Roundhouse that are themes that our library guide and certainly some of the other NEA partners are going to talk about. Things like jurisdictional, legal issues, sexual violence on reservation lands, the difficulty or impossibility in many cases of prosecuting offenders, the complications that arise between federal, state, tribal law, jurisdiction. That's a huge part of the book, The Roundhouse. And actually, Erdrich herself says that's the impetus for why she wrote the book. She had interviewed several Native American women who were survivors of sexual assault and or rape. And she was increasingly frustrated realizing that this had been going on for so long and that the prosecution wasn't getting any better, that people were basically just coming on reservations and committing crimes with impunity, and knowing that there was lots of jurisdictional problems, that the likelihood of them being arrested and charged, yet let alone even convicted, was very, very small. And if convicted, the maximums were 1 year and a $5,000 fine. In some cases, it's been improved so that the tribal court could sentence an offender who's been convicted 3 years and a $15,000 fine, but that's the maximum, and that requires the tribal court and the tribal police to have additional training and kind of partnerships with the FBI, and in a lot of cases, those aren't actually happening. So again, that's some of the things behind the scenes as to what motivated Erdrich to write this particular book, The Roundhouse. Just here real quickly, I just did a couple of little screenshots. If you're familiar with her writing, The Roundhouse was preceded in terms of what people are calling the Justice Trilogy by The Plague of Doves, which came out in 2008. The Roundhouse came out in 2012. And then the third book in the trilogy, La Rose, is listed here as well. I discovered maybe a month or so ago, there's a site that focuses on and provides free genealogical charts of all the major characters in this Justice Trilogy, and the address is listed on the site there. If you Google Justice Trilogy Erdrich, you'll find it, but it's also, like I said, listed right here in the PowerPoint. And then finally, what I wanted to note here is, again, while doing this, and I try to maintain an awareness of some of these things because I purchase critical scholarship essays, things like that, for the library, for our students and faculty that are doing research on these areas. There's a book coming out from Michigan State University Press in October called Louise Erdrich's Justice Trilogy, Cultural and Critical Contexts. I don't really have any information about the contributors. I've looked, double-checked this week, didn't really find anything out, but that's really good. There haven't been a lot of books on Erdrich that have focused on the latter half of her career. Most of the books have tended to focus on Love Medicine, The Beat Queen, Tracks, Tales of Burning Love, maybe The Antelope Wife, The Last Report of the Miracles at Little No Horse, the first 10 major novels. But again, she's closing in on 20 novels. So there's going to be more research, more scholarship coming out, and particularly on these three, the Justice Trilogy. Jake, how are we on time?
So we're at 2 o'clock right now.
I can continue, or do you look like we have questions that people are asking?
There haven't been a lot so far, but it's kind of up to you, Joe. I think in terms of how much more material you have to get through, I think it'd be nice to have at least 20 minutes for Q&A. So
sure, if I can wrap up like in 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think so. I think
Okay.
that if that works for everybody too. I mean, this is a community space, so let us know in the chat, and if you have any questions now, for sure.
Okay, so thank you, Jake. I will proceed unless we hear otherwise. Just a little bit of background again about the trilogy, the Justice Trilogy. If you're not familiar with it, the book before the Roundhouse, in terms of them being like the three tied in together, the Justice Trilogy, The Plague of Doves. Erdrich, yes, she's a creative writer, but she's also someone that really values research. She's written about how she goes to the State Historical Society and looks through old newspapers on microfiche and microfilm and things like that. She did some research, and she also was probably aware of people in the area knowing about the history of this. There was an actual case in 1897 in North Dakota. in which a family of 6 non-natives, settler area, people that had settled in the areas, European American farm family, they had been found one day to have been murdered in a pretty heinous, brutal way. The people that discovered the murder were Dakota Indians from the area. And they were very fearful that if they went and reported, that they would be held liable. They went ahead and reported anyways, and sure enough, they were arrested. And while they were being tried and then retried, a mob actually broke into the jail, pulled 3 of the men, 2 men and a boy, pulled them out of the jail in the middle of the night, and proceeded to hang them, to lynch them. And there's a book called Murdering Indians, excuse me. It's by Peter Beadler, who's a retired faculty member. He's written a lot of articles on Louise Erdrich's writing, and he learned about this. And so what he did is he went and found all the primary source documents, the newspapers from the time, and he researched them. And so he documents what actually happened. And then he talks about how it was inspiring for Erdrich and how she used it and then departed from it. She changes the time period. She changes, obviously, the names of the people. I think instead of 1897, she moves it to 1911, things like that. But she uses it in The Plague of Doves, the wrongful lynching of American Indians, to start the story off, and shows that the failure for there to be justice brought to these people who wrongly murdered, lynched 2 men and 1 young boy, they never were brought to justice. They never really suffered any legal consequences. And it continued to be this hidden history, but it was, had ramifications for several generations. That's what caused her to write The Plague of Doves. And so there's obviously this issue of justice there. And then, of course, the Roundhouse also revolves around justice in terms of the assault that happens with Geraldine Coots. There's another very violent thing that happens to a smaller character that touches on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I don't want to say too much about that, again, because we realize that many people haven't read the book. I found a picture of Louise around 2011. She was a Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College for a week, and here's a picture of her there. This is while she was kind of finishing the Roundhouse, and just kind of wanted to kind of contextualize a photo from that time period. And again, I just did a little word cloud of her book titles, and then specifically for the Roundhouse, a name of some of the major characters, a cloud of some of the major characters. Geraldine Coots, Judge Antone Basil Coots, her husband, their son Joe Coots, and then some of his friends and some of the other people involved in the book as well. And finally, one of the other things that I found that the book touches on, this is actually really important, but it's also kind of disturbing that this book needs to exist. I found this as a full text book that you can actually download the references in the PowerPoint at the end. There's a book that came out. It's from the Minnesota Indian Health Resource Center, and the book's titled What to Do When You're Raped, an ABC Handbook for Native Girls. And it's deeply disturbing to know that this book is necessary. It is necessary, but again, it's just very disturbing that this book and that this preponderance of crimes against women and young girls, specifically on American Indian reservations, it's very disturbing that this is tolerated. And that's ultimately what Erdrich is trying to do, is not just to raise awareness, but to also say that raising awareness is not enough. We need to change the law. There needs to be changes in how people are prosecuted and held accountable, because this would not stand if it were mainstream Americans that were dealing with this level of violence, sexual violence, on a regular basis. That's kind of a somber note to end my formal presentation on. But at that point, I'd be getting into the references here that conclude the PowerPoint. So I'm just going to pause and check in with Jake.
Well, Yeah, I think that is a somber note, but also an important one, especially in the context of so much celebration that we're doing, that there's also this tension that's held there that I think the Roundhouse does a really good job of balancing as well, right? Sort of both the heaviness and the levity of what reality is, right? So I think, I mean, Joe, if you're finished with the formal presentation, then it would only be appropriate for us to, again, like thank you really deeply and put lots of love in the chat and maybe like the clap emoji or whatever other ones are available, and then open up for Q&A.
That sounds great.
Cool, excellent. So Joe, if you don't mind stopping your screen share, that will just make it a little easier for us to kind
Sure.
of create some space for folks.
There we go.
So I wanted to ask just a small question, and then Dwayne and Robin in tandem had a question that I'll create some space for them too. But you mentioned during your presentation a kind of comprehensive bibliography of Native American Indigenous authors that you were working on, and I'm assuming that work is not public yet. That's still in the research phase.
Yeah, that's one thing that I mentioned to Jake. One of the things I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to add a couple of things. The Big Read grant goes through the end of March-ish, right, Jake?
Correct.
So if people check in on the library guide where I mentioned the address, I'm going to add a section on American Indian authors, or a note that will take you to a probably just a note that'll take you to a separate web page. I already have a list of couple of hundred people that have one or more books that are actually owned by the ASU library. And so what I can do is I basically have already done the HTML coding, if you will, where it'll connect to the ASU library catalog and show you all the books that our library has, for example. But if anyone, honestly, if any of the people of our attendees today, again, thanking all of you for coming. If anyone is interested in a list of names, send me an email and I would be happy to share that with you. But I am going to put up on a library guide an alphabetical list by last name of the authors that I'm aware of that have published one or more books that our library system owns. And like I said, there are several hundreds. I'm also looking, there's a lot of American Indian authors, but there are also a lot of American Indian artists who have done illustrations for books. And then, you know, there are American Indian writers that have done anthologies, like I mentioned before. So there's all these different roles. There are increasingly, there's not a large, there's definitely more writers, poets, short stories, novelists, but there's a growing body of American Indian scholars in American Indian literature. And so those are things too, where you can find out from an Indigenous viewpoint, what do American Indians who are scholars, who are teaching faculty in literature programs, what do they think about these American Indian novels, these poets, these sorts of things? And so there's all these different categories of people, and they're fortunately now Erdrich's publisher HarperCollins, they have just started a imprint called Heart Drum, where they are re-releasing Cynthia Leadich Smith's early children's young adult books, and they're starting to publish some new books for or by American Indian writers, including some first books ever by some young writers. And so there's a lot of momentum in the industry, the publishing industry, and there's also a growing body of plays by American Indian writers as well. And there's one called Sovereignty by Mary Kay Nagel. That's a really cool book. So there's a lot out there, but again, sorry, not a real short answer, but I will be putting a list of names on the library guide. And if you have any particular questions, feel free to email me. I have a big Excel sheet where I'm keeping track of all this stuff, but I think it's time to put a version 1 out there for people to look at.
Cool. Thank you so much, Joe. Dwayne, I don't know if you wanted to unmute or turn on your video to ask your question. I think it's nice if I don't do all of the talking, but you had a question about the bookstore and also some of Louise Erdrich's advocacy work that I thought could combine into one great question. So maybe if you would like to unmute, feel free. Otherwise, Joe can speak to that. Got it. Excellent. Thank you so much. So yeah, Joe, I guess if you could speak to like basically what Louise Erdrich has done in the community as well, maybe through Birchbark, but then also writing the book, sort of thinking about literary arts as just one tool in you know, an arsenal of ways to create change. Could you speak to some of that work that Erdrich has done?
Sure. She opened her bookstore with her sister Hyde in July 2000. She had moved back from the East Coast to Minnesota in 1999, opened the bookstore about a year and a half later. In 2008, they started it's a small little press. They've published like 5 or 6 titles. I think they've officially ceased the press, but it's called Weegwis Press, where they have Anishinaabe Ojibwe language materials, children's books that were completely done by tribal members, including the illustration and the stories. Erdrich's bookstore started this Weegwis Press, and they published these books to kind of help with language maintenance, language revitalization efforts. So that's one thing. She has a regular reading series where they invite all kinds of guest readers in, including many Indigenous writers. They also have done a lot of community arts work. They have relationships with some nearby art galleries. Erdrich and her sister Hyde and a couple of their friends have done like art installations, things like that. She wrote an article that's definitely related to the Roundhouse in 2013, an op-ed piece in the New York Times called Rape on the Reservation. And it was basically written the week before the vote to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act in 2013. And so she's been fairly vocal in terms of becoming a prominent advocate, not just putting her fiction out there, but actually putting her personal identity out there behind things calling for change. She wrote a couple of editorials about the Standing Rock Sioux and the No DARPA in terms of all of that, which was, I think, in 2017. So she's been increasingly becoming more vocal. I read a couple things where she's talking about possibly writing a book down the road on the history of boarding schools. Which would be, again, she's a person qualified to do it. It's a very difficult subject to write on, but she's managed, I think, quite successfully to write about a difficult topic like the violence in the Roundhouse and in the LaRose book, and also the Plague of Doves. So she's really, I think it's safe to conclude that she's becoming a much more political person, not just as a writer, but in terms of her community work and activism. And she's got a lot of name recognition now. And so I think she's very cognizant of that and is trying to use that for good.
Cool. Thank you so much. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if anybody had a question and wanted to drop it in there, or to say, I have a question, the hand raising is a little bit hard for me to see personally. If somebody feels like they would like to unmute and just ask a question too, we can hold the little space. Otherwise, I'll ask maybe one or two while people might be thinking. Sometimes I love silence. And I saw an unmute.
Yeah, I had a question.
Lovely.
On the books that she's rewritten, do you know, is it her hope or expectation that someone who had already read the book would read these new editions also?
Yeah, I think if you were to look at, there's a couple of books that talk about there's a collected book of interviews called Conversations with Louise Erdrich and Michael Doris, and it talks about her reasoning for revising the Love Medicine book, the 1984 version becoming the 1993 version. And she talks about that she didn't like some of the things. For example, she did a little bit of wordsmithing, changing. There's a scene that 2 characters meet, and they proceed to kind of have unplanned sexual encounter. And she rewrote it because she thought it came off as maybe not as consensual as she wanted it to be, because these people end up becoming a couple. And she realized when she reread it that it was maybe not as clear cut that it was consensual. And so she did some things like that. She also didn't like the order of the book, for example. So she did reorder some of the chapters, and she felt like she had shorted a couple of characters that she realized that she could provide a fuller history of some of the characters. And so she added a couple of chapters like that. And as far as the Antelope Wife goes, I didn't touch on this. There's a lot you could talk about with Erdrich. Many of you, some of you might know, she was married to another writer, Michael Doris. They wrote together on a lot of things. They only published one novel jointly with both their names, The Crown of Columbus, which actually for both of them was their least successful in terms of literary merit, if you will. It was commercially successful, but neither of them was really too pleased with the actual outcome of it. She's been trying to get people to understand that, you know, some of the books that she rewrites them because she just didn't like them, they didn't fit with her overall work. But with The Antelope Wife, it was released in 1998, the year after her husband Doris committed suicide, and she really didn't like the way the book had ended up, and so she really rewrote a large chunk of the book and changed some of the characters' behaviors, actions, if you will, kind of thing like that. But it's hard because if a book has the same title, a novel has the same title, most people don't really know the difference, and that's not a criticism at all. It's, you don't really know by the cover of the art, you know, the cover art of the book jacket or anything like that. You really have to go into the back title of the book and see where it says that this is revised from the original one and da-da-da. So those are the only two books, The Antelope Wife and Love Medicine, that I'm aware that she's actually put out different editions of them. But that's not to say that she couldn't be doing that, planning on doing that with some of her other ones.
So if you haven't read it at all, then you would definitely start with just read the most recent edition and
she does
skip the earlier ones.
Yeah, she has said if someone were to ask her that question, which of course fans, readers have, she has said that the reason that she rewrites it is because she feels that's the one. That's the better book, if you will. That's the definitive one, whatever happens to be the latest published version of the book. Again, like with Love Medicine, it was 1984, 1993, 2013. So there's almost a 30-year difference between the first and the third editions. And so her thinking, the audience, the world of all of her characters has changed quite a bit in 30 years. But if you're ever up for a big challenge, you can read the books in chronological order. I actually did that about 3 or 4 years ago. I read all the novels in order, and then I read all the young adult books in order. And it's really amazing to do something like that. You get a real sense of just this whole community that she's built with all of her characters, and all these kind of hidden or not so obvious relationships between them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah, and I think what I love about this project too is the Big Read and the Roundhouse has been referred to in several articles or interviews as one of the most accessible of Erdrich's work, right? Especially if you look at like The Bag of Doves, where you have these multiple narrators and perspectives, right? And it's interesting that something that has been sort of heralded as so accessible in craft is also, you know, one of the hardest in terms of subject matter. But I think this was sort of leading into a question that I kind of would love to hear your thoughts on, Joe, since I haven't really come across this in any of the other work. It's like Louise Erdrich just seems like such a beloved figure within Minnesota, within, you know, Native American arts and letters, generally speaking. And this book is so difficult in terms of the subject matter. It is incredible that Louise has done such a good job of it, right? And I mean, it sort of speaks to her work that we're building all this programming around it for so many reasons. But I was wondering, has there been sort of in your knowledge or what you've come across, more critical perspectives on Erdrich's work, right? Not necessarily perhaps how she may have managed this really difficult subject matter, but just in general, right? Like, are there criticisms of Erdrich, and how have those been sort of managed and negotiated?
Yeah, most of the response to her writing has been really positive, both from the popular press. She gets written up little blurbs in like Entertainment Weekly now when a new novel comes out or something like that, which is pretty amazing if you're a novelist. One thing too, she really has, just a side note with that, she's kind of consciously decided she's not interested in having any of her novels adapted for movies, at least to this point. She's never done that. She's been approached in the past about that. Almost all of her novels, I think all of her novels and young adult books are also available as audiobooks, things like that. So if you prefer audio, you can look, for example, you can find them as audiobooks. But for your question, Jake, the criticism that sometimes has been charged about her, and for example, in the Roundhouse, sometimes people say that probably because of her her poetical background, her background as a poet, she sometimes overwrites and is too lyrical. Joyce Carol Oates, in a review, the New York Review of Books, said that Joe Coots and his friend Cappy don't talk sometimes like most 13-year-olds that she's ever known, that their prose is a little bit too flowery or something along those lines. Most people are very, very aware that she is not just telling a story increasingly to entertain. She's also taking on that role of educating, informing. What she's always said, the tension for her is she doesn't want to write a diatribe, and she doesn't want to be too didactic, lecturing people. I, of course, am biased, but I think she's very successful at not falling into either of those categories, that she's both entertaining and informative, and especially in very difficult situations where she's talking about things like sexual assault and rape and murder. She's very aware, because many of these are informed by actual historical events, incidents. She's very aware of and sensitive to that. She shows different perspective and puts different viewpoints out there, but she's pretty direct in this particular book, The Roundhouse, that basically she said in some articles afterwards that, the laws just are failing. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it's American Indian women and their families and the communities that are suffering. So she's a little bit more direct in terms of that message than she has been with some of her other books. But again, overall, if there's faults with her writing, it's sometimes that it's too polished, too stylized. The one book that really did get hammered by many reviewers was The Crown of Columbus. And basically at the time, she and her husband, Michael Doris, they wrote like a 1.5 page draft outline. Publisher said, great, go ahead and write it. It was supposed to commemorate the 500-year anniversary of Columbus. And it really was more of a Indiana Jones kind of thriller investigation kind of thing. And people, including some American Indian authors and critics, scholars, criticize her choice, that she kind of did like a kind of a not very serious attack of colonialism, imperialism, that they kind of made it into kind of like a farcical, fancy kind of adventure story. So that's the one novel in particular that was more panned than positive, but most of her other books have been very positive in the reviews, and obviously have been recognized, awarded with various awards and citations, recognitions.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, it's like if the worst thing that someone can say about your book is that it's too well written, it's like you've done a pretty good job, I think, right, as an author. I wanted to segue to Carolyn. So again, if you would like to unmute and sort of ask your question, please feel free. Otherwise, I can just read it for you on your behalf. So I'll just open up a moment.
Can't find my thing. Hi.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. So I wanted to ask, I really appreciate her activism work. And I appreciated the story about how her father encouraged her to write by paying her a nickel a story. So does she do, or has she started to do any work with like young Native writers? She's got a young readers edition, but has she started down the road of promoting maybe young Native writers? So thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's a great question. You know, my knowledge of what she's done in that area is probably limited. I am aware that she has gone, she's done readings with her sisters, and I didn't mention there's so much to talk about. Her sister Hyde, and I think a couple of people commented in the chat, her sister Hyde Erdrich is also a really well-known poet, and she's also edited a couple of literature anthologies, including Sister Nations and New Native American Poetry, which came out in 2019. And then she has another sister, Lizelette, who has written a couple of children's books. And then she has a sister, Angie, who's actually a physician. And I just discovered this about a month ago. She is going to have a book coming out with the Minnesota State Historical Press, Angie, that Angie's the illustrator of the book. But in terms of your specific question, Carolyn, the sisters at various times and in different combinations have worked with the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Community College, and they have done week-long residencies there to encourage community writing, no age restrictions, just basically anyone who's interested in working on their writing skills. The Erdrich sisters have been there and worked with them. Like I said, I know her sister Hyde has edited a couple of anthologies, which have included some emerging, relatively unpublished writers, as well as some established writers. And the Birch Bark books, they do bring in guest readers, including first-time writers and things like that. I imagine that they're doing more things that I'm not aware of. I'm particularly aware of those because if you are interested, Birch Bark Books, you can sign up, as you can guess I have done, and I'm on their news list. So they periodically send you notes about events and things that are going on. And you can go there too and see what Erdrich is doing in terms of, she'll write a lot of what books she's reading, and she'll put up free book reviews and things like that about books where the author is going to be doing presentations and things like that. But I do think that she's doing some things in terms of promoting, and I do think they opened recently, Birch Bark Books, they opened like a zine workshop in the lower level. I don't think it was actually part of the bookstore. They bought the space and they're turning it into a community space for people to work on zines and comic books, just a place for people to go in and work there. So it's kind of a community writing space.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd point to in the chat to one of our partners, Manny Lowley, runs the Emerging Diné Writers Institute, which does a lot of work with high school and college age. Laura Tohi also recently received a Poet Laureate Fellowship grant. But Delisa, you had a great question, and I think that we have time for just one more. So again, if you would like to unmute and ask, please feel free. Otherwise, I will read it for you.
Hi, my name is Delisa, and yeah, I wanted to share too that I've read most of Louise Erdrich's older or first works, I guess, and just love her style of writing, and agree that I guess it can be seen as lyrical, but I love the poetics and the beauty of language and how she works with that. But I'm also just kind of curious about her, has she shared, like, in terms of a writing process? Because you mentioned that research is one of her key areas, but you also mentioned that she's got kind of like a family of writers too. So I'm wondering if they just, I'm just kind of curious, because previously, I think you said her late husband and she used to work and kind of collaborate in some ways or go through that process. And I don't know if she shared anything new about that or how her process works.
Yeah, that's a great question, Delisa. Thank you very much. She did cite her late former husband, Michael Doris, as at the time the biggest influence on her writing. And there were people that wondered, because most people still think of creative writing as that lone individual troubled person writing out, by themselves. and that they tend to question, at least in the literature world. There's a lot of questions about, you know, can two creative people work together, or, you know, will that kind of not work, and who's more responsible, like who's the real writer here and who's just kind of riding on the other person's coattails kind of thing. And there were some questions about that when they were together. Obviously, Louise Erdrich has published many, many books, authored many, many books since her separation with Doris in 1995, and after his suicide in 1997, she's obviously published quite a bit. She cites her father, her late father, as actually her most significant inspiration, or the biggest single influence on her writing. Again, when she was starting out, you would see some things that were published in magazines and short stories, especially Love Medicine. Probably 2/3 of the chapters, and you mentioned you had read some of her early books, many of the early books, Love Medicine, The Beat Queen, Tracks, things like that, many of the chapters were actually published as magazine articles, short stories, and things like that. And then she would revise them. And so you could actually, if you found the original article in the magazine, you could compare it to the finished chapter in the book. And there's a collection of all of her short stories called The Red Convertible. And you might remember The Red Convertible. It's a really great story that's part of Love Medicine. But The Red Convertible, which I think came out in 2008, is about a 700-page book of all of her collected short stories. And you can go and see that some of the published short stories end up taking on different formatting, have some word edits and things like that when you do a comparison with the original magazine article versus the published book chapter. She hasn't really had to financially rely on getting paid through magazines and things like that for a while. She still releases a few things in magazines from time to time, but not a lot of her writing. They're more of editorials or opinion pieces, or things where they're asking her to share her expertise on something. A lot of her creative writing, it's more of an event now when a book comes out, because there are gaps of years between when you see like a piece coming out. You don't really see her in a lot of magazines or newspapers releasing chapters or short stories like she used to. But I do think she did a lot of collaboration with Doris. She also collaborated with him on the books that were published under his name. And he was pretty active for the 17 or 18 years that they were together. And like I said, her sister Hyde is a great writer. I'm sure she has her own process, but Erdrich, I think she's got a pretty big writing community in her family. And she's got, as she's mentioned, great people that she works with at HarperCollins, including people that have been part of her team, if you will, for 20, 30 years. So I think she has a real core group of people that she trusts with her writing at this point.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, Delisa, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting too to know that like the way that she's approaching that world too, with like, you know, multiple perspectives or stories and community, to think about how one crafts a novel in sort of these threads or these voices, right? Which I think makes the Roundhouse that much more distinct actually as a product.
May I also add to just like the different, like all of the storytelling that she has. And I remember there was the one novel, right now the title just slips my mind, but the main character, or he had passed away, and all of these like former lovers had come out and stuff.
Tales of Burning Love.
That's it. I just thought it was hilarious. I mean, just her ability to kind of explore kind of these different areas, and even areas that seem kind of, you know, in society, you know, kind of secret gossipy things that we talk about. And that in a sense, she would, I don't know if I want to use the word like elevate, like kind of this gossipy stuff, like just linking it back to storytelling. And it just, yeah, she just has great ability to play with language, and also with these different worlds too. And I think for some, yeah, I think just like for me, I was very curious, and I just was able to get into the worlds that she created. But it always went back to just like this sense of telling a big story, And then that was always really interesting. So
Yeah. Thank you. There's one of her most famous narrators, Nana Push, who is kind of the embodiment of the oral story, the traditional storyteller. And he has a line where he's like hooked mouth to, yeah, I forget exactly, but basically hooked in the mouth like a fish. And like once he starts talking, and I can relate, I apologize, he can't stop. He just starts dumping out all these stories. And in the book, The Roundhouse, for example, Musham, who is Joe's grandfather, he is actually a sibling of Nana Push. And so he's this traditional teller in the Roundhouse. And what's really interesting with Erdrich that I like, she can talk at so many different levels, write at so many different levels. She'll talk about things like where you feel like you're sitting around the kitchen table, listening to aunts and uncles and cousins just telling stories and things. And then she'll talk about some really significant things. And she'll be talking about something very significant, but then she'll undercut it. Well, she'll have a character pass wind or something like that. You know, she's very much, she's a hilarious writer. And I think that's one of the things that sometimes people think, especially non-natives think that American Indian writing, especially something if they were to hear about like the Roundhouse, that, oh my gosh, this is really social science, sociological, very serious stuff, you know, It's very humorous. It doesn't mean that it's not important topics or that she's belittling it at all, but she's got a great ability to infuse humor to kind of bring things down a little bit, to kind of reset people, to kind of encourage them to find a way to be resilient. And she's very good about those different kind of approaches. She knows how to ratchet things up and then to bring it back down a little bit with humor. And again, that's one of the things I really like about her, I've always enjoyed, is her sense of humor, and how she mixes like high art with a lot of kind of like you said, Delisa, some gossipy or not so maybe culturally appropriate commentary sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's the poet too, right? Kind of what you were saying in the presentation, that sense of both the line to sort of speak to Delisa's question about craft, but then also that sensitivity to tone in the context of structure, right? It's sort of, when we're thinking about the Roundhouse, not only the content, but also just the craft that goes into that. But we are at 2:38, so we must create some space if people want to go. You probably have other things that you need to do today. We also need to thank Joe for just a really incredible, in-depth, I feel like we almost just need like 6 hours with Joe in a room. Vaccinations, masks, obviously we know there's a pandemic, but it's clear that, Joe, you just have so much to share about Louise, and we can't do that all in 1 hour and a half here, but we're so grateful for what you were able to share. And also knowing too that, you know, we'll all continue to be here, right? Like you'll stay at ASU Library, we'll be here in the community. There are lots of other spaces that we can come together to continue these conversations around the Roundhouse as well. So there's a lot of love in the chat right now. That's beautiful. So please put that in there if you haven't. There is a feedback survey that we have as well. So that will be sent out via email. You don't need to worry about taking that now, but if you do feel fresh and inspired, the link is in the chat. I also want to repost some book clubs and discussions, because I think that this is sort of the next step for us and how we're kind of moving through this grant, right? Is like we've done a kickoff, we've got the introduction, and now we sort of have a month full of programming. So definitely feel free to check out those book clubs and discussions. Let us know if we can help you start your own. We have tons of resources available. We can help you manage systems. You know, we're a center, we do this all the time. If you haven't gotten the book yet, you can check it out from Phoenix Public Library, purchase it from Palabras, wherever you might be available. There's also a lot of other events too. So, you know, the jurisdictional issues, the land recognitions, our own community members here, their family histories, their stories. There's really quite a bit going on. So we encourage you to visit our website, take a look, see what might be interested into you, and let us know what we can do to keep celebrating Indigenous arts and culture in the Valley. So if you feel like hanging out for a little while and maybe speaking a little bit, please feel free. I'll hang out and kind of keep the room open. But other than that, Joe, thank you so much. I'm sorry about the technical challenges. Joe had a vest. He was very, very ready to be looked at. And Thank you all so much for coming. It's been really just a pleasure to spend this time with you, and to hopefully we'll see each other again soon. So
Thank you, Jake.
cool. Thank you, everybody. Bye.